Hello colleagues, and welcome to week one's learning. This week we're going to launch our conversation talking about students as writers and really thinking about the increasing demands for our students. So over time, we've noticed that the Common Core state standards have really addressed that many individuals have felt in the past that our students were not college and career ready. And so in order for our students to be college and career ready, writing plays such a critical component in their readiness skills. And so even moving forward, our students really need a voice, a place to be able to talk about political issues, to talk about personal issues, to make connections, to advocate for themselves, and really take on the information that they accumulate through their knowledge and their skill set and be able to use that information and impact others and a particular audience. So truly, their form of communication and their voice is really channeled through writing itself. And they need to be able to synthesize information. They need to be able to organize information. They need to be able to reflect on things that they've read or thoughts that they have and really respond. And then in that response, really be able to compare and contrast, to think about information that they've accumulated, and then how does their own knowledge or skill set impact that information moving forward, and then how do they use that writing as a vehicle to be able to create a new skill set and new knowledge. And so our state standards really try to focus deeply on student writing and really think about our writers in various genres from kindergarten all through their college graduation and their high school, and their college readiness as well. So all of the vertical expectations are really synthesized from K to higher learning. And so ultimately, how does that impact teachers and students moving forward? So in order for writing to go well for teachers and students, we really need to create a community of writers where the teacher really models what it is to engage in the writing process and is really thinking deeply about the skills and strategies necessary to be an effective writer and engages in that process themselves and really promotes that writerly life in a community. And really thinking about that relationship between the teacher and the student is critically important in order for writers to feel confident enough to be able to engage in the writing process. So there has to be some level of trust where the student is willing to take risks because they see the teacher modeling risk-taking during a writing activity. And so during that time as a writer, they need to feel like they're watching you take risks and make mistakes and seeking feedback. And so you're modeling writing and you're really being explicit. And so you're really showing how expert writers write, how you write, and how difficult and challenging it is for a writer to engage in the process. And you're seeking feedback from students because as a writer, you need to know how your audience will be impacted by that information. So audience is so critically important. So within that writing community, you need to create that structure where writers feel really part of that integrated exchange between student and teacher. And so that explicit craft, as you study other authors as mentors, you're really discovering information and you're really thinking about what it takes and why a writer made the choices that they made. And then how you as a writer might make choices depending on how you want to impact your audience. So that instruction is really visible. And also your instruction is visible in student work. And so when you've taught something, you will want to see it in the future with your students. So just because we've taught it doesn't mean we're going to see it, but over time, we should begin to see it. So sometimes we'll teach an instructional strategy in one particular genre. For example, we might be teaching narrative writing, and we might be teaching leads and how to begin a lead with thinking, action, or dialogue. But your student may not be ready to engage in that. They may attempt it. They may only use talking, right? Some type of, or internal thinking to begin a lead. But then you might notice over time that they try another strategy as a writer. So you're going to see this reciprocal process of them moving back and forth between the instruction that you've taught them and what they're willing to engage in developmentally. So it's important that we're looking for our instruction and sort of noticing when it's there. Your hard work will pay off. You will see it in your writers over time, but you have to be patient and really set your expectations that it will be there. So your anchor charts and the way you explicitly demonstrate or model or put resources up for students to refer back to over time is really critically important, because you have taught it, but teaching it again and again will really help for it to make it the explicit instruction be more transferable to their own learning. So those opportunities that they have to practice, right? So writers don't get better practicing 10 minutes a day. Writers need to engage in the type of practice where they're practicing over and over again every single day. So no matter what it is that you want to get better at, you need to practice. So within our school day, we have to show that writing has a priority, and also writing across the curriculum. So the number of times they engage in writing practice throughout the day really increases their ability to synthesize, organize, and really find that voice as writers and practice some of the strategies that you've taught them so they can be transferable. So practicing is the only way that you're actually going to get to see your instruction pay off in student work. And so finishing a prompt, right, is not really authentic writing. It is simply responding. And sometimes our students do need to respond to a prompt. They need to know how to do that type of work, but that's only one aspect of writing. So finishing your sentence does not really engage them in the writing process. But sometimes answering a prompt is a critical part of writing, but it's not our only vehicle to be able to develop student work and to be able to develop the capacity of a writer over time. So sometimes the fact that they can answer a prompt in one moment in time does not mean that they are improving their capacity as a writer over time. So we want to think about that gradual release of responsibility. How are we being explicit in modeling? How are we modeling as a teacher? How are our mentor authors modeling? And then when do we try it with the students? How do we do some shared writing together, which is a critical component to our curriculum? And then when do we release that responsibility? So it's important that we do not feel like we have to teach everything before we engage them in practice. So sometimes when we launch a genre, we want to teach students everything about that particular genre before we give them the opportunity to practice. Or we stay in the we do together too long, so they might be crafting a story alongside of you, and then they don't get to practice independently. So we should see their writing get better over time, so it's almost abandoning a piece because it's not ready, and then teaching to the next piece, and then looking for instruction in the next piece, because they're not going back and editing and revising the same piece over and over again is something that writers do, but it's not something that sometimes developmentally students will engage in because they almost feel frustrated with that particular process and they don't engage themselves as writers to move forward. So they need to be able to have some choice and make some decisions as writers, and we need to give them the opportunity to do that through these multiple opportunities to practice. And then we want to be able to highlight replicable craft moves. So our explicit instruction should be something a writer does, not something that is just specific to that piece. So sometimes when we go to confer with writers, we want to talk to writers, we say it takes a really long time because we're so engaged in that piece. So if you think about a writing conference sounding something like a student goes fishing with their mom, right, or their dad, right, and then you'll say to them, so what did your mom say when she put the worm on the hook? And then what did you say? Instead of saying something like, writers sometimes use talk in the moment. So in your mind right now, I want you to talk through the conversation that you and your mom were having when you were fishing, and writers use that as a way to be able to write more or expand. So as a writer, this is what you'll do. In this moment, you can try this, but every day as a writer, you're going to try this particular strategy. So that's that actionable feedback. What are they doing as a writer to get better over time, right? And you're going to be clear and focused on your goals for your writers so that it transfers from piece to piece and they don't feel like it's specific, because a lot of times we're frustrated that our instruction isn't visible because we don't see it in piece after piece. We only see it in that piece. And once the child or the student puts that piece of writing away, they almost abandon the strategies that they have, and they're not looking for that transfer of their writing skills into every single piece. So the focus typically from our standards really thinks deeply about narrative writing, persuasive or opinion writing, and informational writing. And narrative writing, which encompasses many different formats, personal narrative, writing fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, memoir, biography, narrative nonfiction, and reading and writing within those genres so that students have multiple opportunities to practice. And the more they actually read a particular genre, the more craft moves they will internalize. And the more they think about why an author did something in a particular text, or thinking deeply through their reading, they're going to get better as writers as we highlight these craft moves that authors are intentionally making. Again, with persuasive writing or opinion, students can engage in really studying mentors of letters, petitions, speeches, and then again writing them, essays, editorials, research essays. So there are many formats that students can study and also should engage in writing. So it's really that reciprocal process between studying the mentors, being exposed to deep reading and extenuous reading. So they should be reading these types of genres over and over again and have just as much practice time to read as they do to write. So that reciprocal exchange as you're studying genres deeply. And then informational and procedural writing, how-to books, directions, recipes, lab reports, articles, websites, blogs, reports, memos. So if we think about a trajectory of skills in even from kindergarten, first grade, we really are introducing many aspects of the genre or writing that developmentally children can only take on at their developmental stage. So when you think about even narrative writing in kindergarten, students are doing a lot of oral rehearse, they're doing a lot of talking, they're doing a lot of writing and producing pictures for meaning and telling a story through pictures over time. And then in first grade, they engage in that same type of work. And then vertically, the work becomes more and more complex, but students really are engaged in that same type of work over and over again over time. And so we want to expose them to mentors that we read aloud to them at a text that's a little bit higher than their reading level, and that they have opportunities to read appropriate texts that they can make connections and form meaning from, so that they understand the process in their literacy development. And again, I can't highlight enough the importance of time and allowing students enough time to read and write. There should be opportunities for authentic writing. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but really having some student choice around what they're writing, how much of a piece they should write. We should know when to push forward and have them not abandon every piece of writing, but when they're ready to engage on and move to that next piece. And they should really have opportunities for an authentic audience. They shouldn't feel like the purpose for writing is just for their teacher, right? So they're writing to complete an assignment. That really shouldn't be their vision or philosophy about writing. Writing should feel like their voice and their place to really impact an audience with their important message. So regardless of whether they're writing with pictures to impact their audience, to form some type of meaning or tell something or convey information, right? Regardless if you're kindergarten or writing in college or beyond, right? We always need to feel like our writing is purposeful, because without that, without an audience and without purpose, why should we write? It's so difficult and challenging if we don't have a purpose to write it for or someone to share it with. Just writing something just to write it is not really enough to engage our learners. And we know that engagement is so important. It's as important as interesting content and mentor texts. They have to feel engaged in the process as writers in order to be able to engage enough to practice to the level to improve their quality of writing. So that meaning has to really come forth, and they need to be able to study models of writing so they can write it like that, and they can write around similar topics, and they should feel safe to take risks and even write about the same thing you just modeled in your writing. So the number of times that I wrote about my dog running away, escaping out my front door, and everyone chasing her through the woods, right? Next thing, 5 other students chose to write about their dog who ran away. To me, as long as they're practicing writing and trying the craft moves and the strategies that I explicitly modeled, they'll tire of that topic, and then they'll have to write about a topic that they understand and know deeply so that they'll be able to write about that topic. So some of it involves some risk-taking and helping us build a community so that our writers feel like they're willing to take risks around their own topics. And again, that actionable feedback is so important so they understand next steps. And then thinking about opportunities for them to engage in the writing process. So again and again, I'll be referring back to the writing process and really thinking about how often we see it listed in steps, but ultimately it really is such a fluid process that the writing process itself moves from stage to stage over and over again. And so sometimes teachers feel frustrated when they're trying to engage in the writing process with their students, and they want all students to be planning at a certain time. And then they want to engage in some type of oral rehearse for a certain amount of time. And then it just simply becomes frustrating. So ultimately, students are going to be at different places in the writing process at different times. So I'm going to just take a minute to talk about each one of the steps in the writing process and what it might sound and look like. So planning is really that initial thinking that happens around a topic. Sometimes it's just generating topics. What might I write about? So as a narrative writer, what strategies do I have to be able to generate topics? How am I going to plan that work? Am I going to think about important people in my life? Am I going to think about a time when with that person? Am I going to think about the best time? Am I going to think about the worst time with that person? So what are my strategies that help me move forward? And then how will I organize that work? So what are some different models that you have shown to support students in that planning process? And this planning process should really be very quick. We know that students sometimes can perseverate on the planning process, but for modeling and engagement purposes, they should really be able to develop a very quick plan and be able to sort of talk through that plan quickly and be able to take some brief notes around that, because oftentimes students who spend too much time planning, they do not have enough energy left around the piece to actually create a draft and revise in order to make that piece better. So this looks many different ways in many different classrooms and in many different experiences for all writers, but it's important that students understand the purpose and the power behind planning. They should feel like they could not write a piece until they began planning first. And then when we think about rehearse, we think about that oral aspect of taking that plan and actually talking the writing. So students often talk much better than they can write. So they can often talk the plan. So if you can get a student to hold up their plan and simply orally rehearse it, there'll be much more in that original draft than if you skip this oral rehearse plan and what that sounds like. So inevitably, they can take it can look like in different formats. Like they can rehearse with a partner, they can rehearse in their head after they've already rehearsed with a partner, but you want to really model this so that it sounds like real authentic writing. So it's not like I'm going to write about this in this area. It's going to sound more like the actual story itself. So if I think about my plan around fishing with my son, right? The beginning part of my oral rehearse wouldn't be, I'm going to write a story about fishing with my son. My oral rehearse would sound like, grab the poles. Don't forget to shut the car door. Do you have everything? I forgot the worms, Mom. So it should actually sound like the story itself. And our model is critically important that we engage with using our plan to get that oral rehearse out so that students can revise. Because you're going to ask them to do more oral rehearsing later after they already have a draft. They may go into specific pieces of their draft as they just sort of flash draft and get their story out to be able to lift up that quality. So revising itself is really making that story better. So drafting is simply when we get it out all on paper. Here it is. Right? We've used our plan, we got it out, and it should be quick and fast. Sometimes we want the draft to be a better quality, to be written with nicer handwriting, right, than it actually should be, because we need students to get that fluency in writing and get that story out from the oral rehearse and then lift the quality in the revision and be able to talk through different pieces, oral rehearse, plan that section again. So revision is not fixing spelling and punctuation. Revision is creating a place where the meaning from the story gets better. We hope that what we've taught for our students in spelling and adding punctuation becomes fluent enough over time as we teach it again and again and again, because we know how difficult it is for transfer, that they would do it with automaticity and with fluency. But ultimately, we want to get the story out, and then as they are revising and rereading, hopefully they're doing some of this editing on their own, but the revision process is really lifting the quality of the writing and then finally editing pieces before the publish. So the editing piece is sometimes very overwhelming. So you may just choose to edit a certain piece depending on the developmental age of your student or grade level. So you might just edit the first paragraph to make sure all the words are spelled correctly, or their high frequency words are spelled correctly, or that the punctuation is added. As your students engage in different grade levels, the expectation is higher, and it almost becomes automatic that it would be in the draft. And your expectation should be high that if they know how to spell a word, that it's included in that draft. We know that doesn't always happen, but we hope that that's what we would be calling for and asking for. Like, you know how to spell that word. That shouldn't be spelled that way. So even as you're modeling, you're sort of alluding to that fact while you're explicitly providing that instruction. And then finally, that editing when a student is ready to publish. And so this process should happen over and over again. So if you think about studying a genre for around 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, and engaging in that process, depending on the developmental stage of your students, they should have multiple pieces, not just one piece, not 2 pieces, but multiple pieces that students have engaged in this writing process so that they ultimately have the opportunity to practice and transfer your instruction over time again and again, and hopefully the opportunity to engage with that genre again in a different point in the school year when they have learned more skills or learned more revision, more editing strategies. And so that piece at the beginning of the year as they engage with the genre would be better towards the end of the year.